Hello and welcome to Behind the Story. I'm Sebastian Gomes, an executive editor at America Media. Pope Benedict XVI has passed away after a long and enormously consequential life, both for the Catholic Church and the whole world. As believers and non-believers alike are mourning him, we're now beginning to reflect on his legacy. And to help us in that regard, I'm joined today by Christopher Bellitto. He's a professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey, and he's written and lectured specifically on Benedict's post-resignation papacy, which began in February of 2013. And that's what we'll be discussing today. Thanks for joining us, Christopher. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on a sad day.
Now, before we get started, I invite everyone to subscribe to our YouTube channel and comment below. Let us know how you are remembering Pope Benedict and what you think of his historic resignation back in 2013. So let's start there, Christopher. It was February 11th of that year. Benedict announced his decision in a meeting with cardinals. It was sudden, it was jarring, but it wasn't totally unprecedented, right?
That's right. So the first pope to have resigned that we can record is a fellow by the name of Pontian in the year 235, when bishops of Rome were not quite the popes yet, and Christianity is still illegal in the Roman Empire. He was set to be sent to a prison on the island of Sardinia that was known to be so brutal that he was sure he would die. And he was afraid that news wouldn't get back to Rome. So he resigned so somebody could be replaced. The most spectacular resignation in history was not the most recent, and that was in 1294, when Celestine V, the hermit who should not have been elected pope in the first place and only lasted 6 months, resigned. And he's spectacularly well known because Dante puts him at a spot at the doorway between heaven and hell, for the place reserved for people who had done neither good nor ill in their lives. And he called it in Italian il gran rifiuto, the great refusal. But the last pope to resign before Benedict XVI was at a very difficult period in the church's life, the Great Western Schism, when there were 3 popes and 3 papacies. And Gregory XII, who probably had the best claim to be pope as the Roman pope, resigned in 1415 as a way of getting back to unify the church.
And from what we know about Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, how he was a great student of history, we have to assume that he was aware of these other popes who had resigned in different circumstances throughout history, right?
Yes. In fact, he visited the grave of Celestine V, as Pope Paul VI had done in L'Aquila. And he took off this particular cloth that he wears around his neck called a pallium. It's a white piece with dark crosses on it. And he laid it, everyone figured as a gesture of respect, on the tomb of Celestine V. Maybe that was a signal that we all missed.
So the decision to resign was not unprecedented, but he did it in a rather unique way. So when he did resign in 2013, he kept the name Pope, or the title Pope. He added the word Emeritus, so he was known after his resignation as Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. He also chose to wear the white cassock, which is the traditional outfit of the sitting Bishop of Rome. And he spent his remaining years actually inside the Vatican at a monastery that's inside the territory of Vatican City. So there is a precedent for a pope resigning, but is there a precedent for a Pope Emeritus in the way that Benedict actually did it?
That's right. He came up with that title, and that's a very professorial title. When a man or a woman after a long career as a professor retires, they are emerita or emeritus. So it makes sense for this Professor Pope to have picked that name. But wearing the white, keeping the name, became extremely, extremely confusing. He didn't wear a particular little short cape, which means nothing other than to real inside baseball Vatican watchers. And so that kind of led to a narrative that there were 2 popes, which is not true.
So how did it play out? I think it was early on after his resignation that he actually said explicitly that he intended to, in his own words, remain hidden from the world. So what did we see in those years after his resignation? Certainly his intention was perhaps to remain out of the spotlight, but how did it play out?
Well, he didn't keep that promise. Now, whether it's because he didn't keep that promise or other people wanted to use Benedict as a counterweight to a pope that no one expected, and that was Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who had come in second in the conclave that had elected Benedict XVI, and everyone figured, well, there's no second acts. And so he may have been, as he got older and frailer, quite frankly, used. There are some incidents here where I have some real questions about elder abuse. So he gave interviews when he said that he wouldn't give interviews. He kept writing, and it was sometimes confusing because he would write under Joseph Ratzinger, sometimes under the byline of Joseph Ratzinger, and other times under the byline of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. And that became very confusing as well. His was a papacy of unintended consequences. One remembers that he gave a speech at Regensburg where he quoted a late medieval emperor saying some very nasty things about Muslims, which was a very professorial thing to do, to start a class with something controversial. And that, of course, led to great tensions with Islam, which he did great work in repairing by visiting the Blue Mosque in Turkey, by going to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So his emeritus papacy was also an emeritus papacy of unintended consequences. And I think that sometimes, quite frankly, that he was being used. For instance, his secretary, Archbishop Georg Ganswein, who kind of positions himself as a go-between between Benedict and Francis, in 2016 came up with this idea that they're kind of co-popes, one active and one passive. And that was interpreted by many people as Ganswein's attempt to remain relevant. But in 2019, after the synod that Pope Francis held about the clergy sex abuse scandal and finally was talking about accountability of bishops as well, a letter came out that Benedict had allegedly written, because we don't have proof that he wrote it, which seemed to undercut all of the findings of that synod, that it was pedophilia and the cover-ups were a global phenomenon. It didn't have anything to do with the 1960s. This is not an issue of homosexuality. And it kind of undercut all of those. But if you read that letter, it did not sound like Joseph Ratzinger, who was a very systematic and very elegant writer. And one wonders if this wasn't the table talk musings of an elderly gentleman, which were cobbled together so that people could say, Benedict says. And that's one of the reasons why we need to have some protocols for a future emeritus papacy.
And certainly the point that you just made about his age is such an important one, because we do have a precedent for that with a much brighter spotlight on it, which was the waning years of John Paul II, and how more and more he was incapacitated, but was still exercising his authority as Pope. And people talk about Benedict's resignation as his own sort of humble response to that, and not wanting to go through something like that. And yet here we are, breaking down his post-resignation papacy and seeing the musings, like you said, perhaps of an elderly man, but being interpreted outside in many, many different ways that could be causing confusion.
Yeah, I think again it's a mark of the love that Ratzinger had for the church. That I think when he was watching as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a very high-ranking official in the Vatican, while he was watching John Paul II die, which is very painful for all of us who's watching your grandfather die, I think he was saying two things. One is that I'm not going to let that happen to me, the individual, but I'm also not going to let that happen to the church, because what if John Paul II had fallen into a persistent vegetative state? There is no canon law on that. And so there are also some precedents for people writing contingent resignation letters. The most famous one is Pius XII, living in Rome when Mussolini's forces were there, and famously, supposedly, again, we don't have the letter, saying, if the Nazis come in, all they'll get is Cardinal Pacelli. So the fact that he would, but that raises a question. if you are supposed to renounce the papacy according to Canon 332 freely and manifestly, openly. Well, if you're physically taken captive, are you free to resign? If you write a contingent letter, which we know that Paul VI did in 1965, that John Paul II did in 89 and 94, and it turns out that Benedict had as well, a letter that says something like, if I am physically or mentally incapacitated, I therefore resign. The question becomes, when he wrote the letter, he may have been of sound mind and body. But who says when the letter should be put into play? And clearly what we need is a commission of cardinals is the most likely one, working with psychologists and physicians to figure out when that happens. That's a discussion that the church needs to have. Perhaps it was impolite to have it when Benedict was still alive, but we need to have it now.
Perhaps the person impacted by Benedict's post-resignation papacy the most is Pope Francis, the current pontiff. Looking over those years, what impact do you see that period having on him, like him personally, but also on his mission and his vision for the Catholic Church during his papacy?
Well, I don't think Francis is somebody who spends a lot of time reading his own press releases, and he doesn't really care whether people like him or don't like him. I think we're going to now find out that they had more of a personal relationship than we might know. Think about this. In the United States, where we are right now, but in other countries as well, when a prime minister or a president steps down, loses an election, resigns, it's common to have other presidents and prime ministers who are out of office. And there was a great book written called The President's Club that talked about the unlikely relationships between, for instance, Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, whom he beat. But for the last 600 years, there has never been a prior pope floating around to whom the pope could speak and say, what is it like to hold this burden? How did you make this decision? So I would imagine that there was a great deal of consolation. Francis said many times, he is my grandfather. They're about 10 years apart. He is my grandfather. He has my back. So I bet that they were in closer contact than we thought.
If we zoom out a little bit and look at Benedict's resignation, in light of his entire life and his pontificate, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, this was a pope who was labeled as someone who was more traditional, but it's sort of counterintuitive, right? That somebody who is more traditional would break with 600 years of tradition and making this call to step aside. So I'm wondering, from that broader perspective, what does this tell you about the person of Joseph Ratzinger and his relationship to the Church?
Well, it's easy to make quick distinctions between John Paul II and Benedict XVI, right? Big papacy, small papacy, extrovert, introvert, guy who loved the media, a guy who hated the media, not personally, but didn't enjoy it. And so what you had was a man who focused the office not on him. He said, it's not about me. The papacy is not me. It's bigger than I am. And this is really about Jesus Christ. And so I think his legacy is going to be the 3 volumes that he wrote on Jesus the Christ, the encyclical Deus Caritas Est, the great talks he gave about the fathers of the church, great catechesis. But he said, by resigning, he says that this is bigger than I am. And when I can't do the job anymore, who walks away from it? The problem was that he should not have worn white. He should have worn a black. But, he said, the reason that I kept wearing white was that there were no other clothes available in my size at the time, which kind of, belies belief. We shouldn't have been calling him Benedict. When a man becomes pope, he chooses a new name. If that man resigns, Benedict is no longer Benedict. So perhaps we should have called him Bishop Ratzinger, or to keep the first name papal style, Bishop Joseph. Black robe, maybe we'll give him the white zucchetto just as a reminder. His ring must be destroyed. He goes back to wearing the ring that he was wearing as a bishop. and he doesn't get involved. He can't publish. He can't give interviews. It's just, we saw what happened. We can't have that again. Nevertheless, in this world of raw power, where we have lost humility as a virtue, who walks away from this kind of position? And so, if you are an anti-Ratzinger guy, if you are someone who did not like Benedict, then you would say in a very nasty way, the best thing he ever did was resign. But viewed in the light of his dedication to the church, whether you agree with that dedication or not and how it played out, he loved the church so much that he realized he could no longer serve the church in the way it needed to be served. And that resignation proved that humility is still a virtue.
Yeah, lots to think about for the institutional Catholic Church moving forward. Christopher Bellitto, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Christopher Bellitto is a professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey. You can Google his name and you'll find some of his work. He's also taught a number of mini courses at learn25.com, and he's the author of Ageless Wisdom, Lifetime Lessons from the Bible, which is published by Paulist Press. And again, please subscribe to our channel to get more great content on the life and legacy of Pope Benedict and the Catholic Church. And comment below. Let us know how you're remembering him today. You can find complete coverage from America at americamagazine.org. Thanks for watching.